Today's lesson from Unit 1, Chemistry of Life, is Topic 1.2 about elements of life. There are four main elements that we talk about in biology. They are the building blocks of most molecules, and we have HONC is the easy way to remember them: hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and carbon. So let's go back to hydrogen. What's important to know about them is their atomic number and how many valence shell electrons they have. So hydrogen only has an atomic number of 1, meaning it has 1 proton and it only has 1 electron in its only electron shell. Oxygen has an atomic number of 8, meaning it has 8 protons and 8 electrons. Its first shell has 2 electrons, leaving 6 in its outermost shell. So that means it has 2 empty spaces in its outer shell, which make it a very good partner for a covalent bond, especially with 2 waters, right? It has 2 empty spaces, and 2 hydrogens would have 2 electrons, making a very nice water molecule. The other 2 that we need to talk about are nitrogen and carbon. Nitrogen we won't talk about quite as often. We will talk about nitrogen in a few minutes, though, when we talk about functional groups. But for now, it has an atomic number of 7, so it has 5 valence shell electrons. So that means it has 3 empty spots for electrons. Carbon is the one that we will talk about the most. Carbon-based molecules are organic compounds. Those are the molecules that make up living things. The macromolecules, which we're going to talk about in the next section, carbohydrates, lipids, proteins, nucleic acids, those are all carbon-based molecules. And what's so special about carbon is that with an atomic number of 6, that means that it has 2 electrons in its first shell, and its outer shell has 4 electrons. That means that it has 4 empty spaces. Because it's half full, that means it is not likely to either lose or gain electrons to make an ionic bond. This makes it the perfect base for covalent molecules. So again, carbon molecules, carbon, with its valence half filled, it's going to share and create covalent bonds with most other elements. These are the building blocks of all living things. Carbon can share more than 1 electron and create double and triple bonds with other atoms. And again, these form organic compounds, which are molecules based on carbon. They have a carbon backbone to them. And those are all of the molecules that make up living things, which we'll talk about, again, those macromolecules in the next section. Isomers. Basically, what you need to know about isomers is that it is a molecule with the same molecular formula, but a different structure. As a result of those different structures, it's going to have different properties. And in the world of biology, your properties, your form, determines your function. So this is important in the pharmaceutical industry, where you may have, like down here, both of these molecules have 6 carbons and 14 hydrogens, but you can see that they are arranged differently. So that means that the shape of these molecules is different. That means they are going to have different properties. They're going to act differently and be able to do different things. If you think back to a 9th grade biology, you will remember that the shape of molecules is really important to how they fit together and how they're able to function. Think of enzymes, for example. So shape in biology is a very, very important factor. We call that the structure and function of an organism, or the structure and function of a molecule. Its structure, its structural components determine how it's able to function. There are different types of isomers. I wouldn't worry too much about this. I wanted to put them in there so you had an idea and you could see that there were some differences between them. Again, this is a structural isomer, so the shape of it is very different from them, but they have the same exact molecular formula. Geometric isomers have the kind of the side groups there. They're flip-flopped around. One's on the same side, they're on the opposite side. This is cis when they're on the same side, trans when they're across from each other. Again, I wouldn't worry too much about memorizing all of this. And enantiomers mean that they're mirror images of each other, as you can see in the diagram here. This becomes very important when pharmaceutical industry is trying to make prescriptions. They need to make sure that just because they put 6 carbons together or 5 carbons together and 14 hydrogens, that it's actually aligned the correct way. Otherwise, you could have very detrimental effects from that in the medication that you're building. And then the last part of this section is about the functional groups. The functional groups, they are attachments to that carbon-hydrogen backbone. A hydrocarbon is what we call that. They can replace some of the hydrogens in a carbon skeleton, and they are very involved in chemical reactions. They are the parts that react with other parts of molecules. We're going to talk about each of these. It is really important that you memorize each of these functional groups, because as we go down the road and talk about different topics, there are certain features of particular molecules, like an amino acid, for example. You have to know it is distinguished by which functional groups give it its properties. So we will talk about those as we move forward, but for now it's important that you memorize each of these functional groups. They are responsible for making some hydrocarbons hydrophilic, meaning that they like water. They increase their solubility in water. There are a lot of different features to these functional groups that are going to be important as we talk about different molecules down the road. But for now, let's just go through the functional groups. So the first one is a hydroxyl. That is simply an OH, an oxygen and a hydrogen, that is attached to a hydrocarbon. So we have a hydrocarbon, right? We have a carbon backbone with a bunch of hydrogens here, and then we have our hydroxyl group attached to it. A lot of times these are alcohols. They end with ethanol. They end with that "-ol" as an alcohol. That part you don't have to memorize, but you do need to know that a hydroxyl group is an OH. Our next functional group is carbonyl. Carbonyl is anywhere you have a carbon that has a double bond to an oxygen. Again, there's more information here than is absolutely necessary for you to know. If it's at the end of the molecule, it's considered an aldehyde. If it's in the middle, it's a ketone. That's a little more organic chemistry. You will see that when you take that in college. But for our purposes, you need to know that a carbonyl group is a carbon with a double bond to an oxygen. Carboxyl is a carbon double bonded to an oxygen and a single bond to a hydroxyl group here, hence why it has the oxyl in it, because it has a hydroxyl. So this is structurally what it looks like here. Look at this one here. We have our hydrocarbon base, and then we have our carbon double bonded to oxygen, and then a hydroxyl group attached to it. So C double bond to O and an OH make up a carboxyl group. Quite often these are acids. We're going to talk about amino acids quite a bit in this school year. We'll talk about fatty acids a little bit as well as a part of a lipid, but you need to know a carboxyl group and be able to identify what a carboxyl group looks like. An amino group is another one that we will talk about quite a bit, especially when we talk about amino acids. An amino acid is a nitrogen and 2 hydrogens. Sometimes it can have 3. That just means it has a positive charge to it. So sometimes you will see NH3+. That is also considered to be an amino group. So these are your 2 examples of amino groups right there. Again, we will talk about these when we talk about amino acids, but for now, amino is an NH2, sometimes an NH3+. It's the only one with nitrogen in it, so it's the easiest one to recognize. A sulfhydryl group is a sulfur bonded to a hydrogen. We won't see this one too often, but again, it's pretty self-explanatory. It's the only one with sulfur in it right there. Phosphate, we will talk about a lot with energy molecules. Phosphate groups have a lot to do with the transfer of energy between organic molecules. It is a phosphate with 4 oxygens attached to it. As a result of that, though, it actually has a negative charge to it. 2 of the oxygens gain extra electrons, and they have a negative charge to them, which makes it highly reactive, which is why it is a very big component of energy molecules. Okay, so phosphate group is PO4. A methyl group is a carbon with 3 hydrogens attached to it up here, a methyl group. And we will talk about this when we talk about DNA. DNA can be methylated, which means that it has the addition of methyl groups to it, and it actually it makes the DNA unreadable for protein synthesis, and it actually regulates the expression of a gene, and it pretty much shuts off the production of a particular protein. So we will talk about this quite a bit when we talk about DNA and protein synthesis. But for now, a methyl group is CH3. And that is the end of that section for now.